Big Sur, Santa Lucia Mountains, California. Within the mountainous and coastal cliff region of Big Sur and the Santa Lucia Mountains hides a persistent mystery, one in which that dates back hundreds of years. To those who have seen these enigmatic figures are often left with more questions than answers. Travelers to these mountains are often left with the feeling that they are not alone, and when they look up, they find out they truly aren't. These figures loom over humans observing. Immortalized by both authors and poets, the true nature of these shadowy beings remains just as cloudy as the mist in the clouds of the Santa Lucia Mountains themselves. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we dive back into the realm of the paranormal to figure out if these hills truly have eyes and to figure out what could be the explanation for the beings known as the Dark Watchers. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and this is the very first episode of Season 2, so I want to welcome you to the official start of Season 2. Obviously, I took that little bit of time off to kind of get my ducks in a row, so to speak, in terms of planning out the next couple episodes, and obviously getting some future things squared away. I do want to announce that in the coming weeks, I will be introducing a new intro music that'll be coming new, as well as hopefully some transition tunes in between some of the sections as well. I hope to have that implemented in the next couple weeks. I have a very close friend of mine working on that because I am music illiterate and music is nothing that I know anything about. So I have put it in his hands to do that for me, and hopefully it will be ready very soon. When it does come out, I hope you all enjoy it, but I do want to make that special announcement. Now, obviously, this is the welcome to Season 2, and this is the very first episode of Season 2, and I appreciate all of your patience waiting the extra week for this episode to drop. Now, before we get started, I just want to say that I appreciate everybody for the support so far, but the best is yet to come, and I hope that you will continue to stick with me, and I continue to build this show in the direction that I absolutely think it could go. With that being said, let's talk a little bit about this topic for this week's episode. Now, today's topic is a little bit of a combo. I think it seems very paranormal in nature, but I guess it could also kind of fall under the cryptid type category as well, kind of depending on what you believe, kind of depending on the stories that you've read. So I obviously wanted to get away from missing persons and true crime because I feel like a lot of my content's been that recently for no reason in between. I just kind of feel like they've just lined up that way. So I wanted to get away from that for a week and talk about this topic because I found this one to be very interesting. And for as many people that have wrote about the Dark Watchers and everybody that is told about the legend of the Dark Watchers, I've surprisingly not heard about them before. Now, let's kind of get into a little bit about the Dark Watchers. Now, the description of the Dark Watchers can sometimes vary, but some things about them remain consistent. They are described as roughly 7 to 10 feet tall, all black in color, much like a shadow person. They have no discernible facial features, and sometimes are described as wearing flowing black cloaks and wide-brimmed hats that are also black in color. Now, some people also say that they can sometimes be seen holding a stick or a staff-like object in their hands as well. Now, I don't want to speculate or go down any particular rabbit holes about shadow people and so on and so forth, but this description that people give of the Dark Watchers seems to go very hand in hand and bear a striking resemblance to that of the Hat Man. Now, I'm not going to go in super in-depth about who the Hat Man is. However, he is another mysterious shadow person / entity, and I did do an episode on the Hat Man back in Season 1, if you want to go and listen to that, if you want more information about him. Now that I've got that out there, and the Dark Watcher's description, and I've kind of talked a little bit about what people say that he looks like, I want to go into the story of the Dark Watchers and the legend and the lore that kind of goes along with it. And the story of the Dark Watchers starts with the native people of this region, known as the Chumash people. Now, the Chumash peoples encompassed an area of almost 7,000 square miles and survived through hunting, gathering, and fishing. They excelled in early boat making, basket weaving, and as well as making stone cookware. Now, the Chumash people would often use the caves of the region for religious ceremonies, and that is where they would do numerous cave drawings as well. Now, not everything would end up being as good as it seemed for the Chumash people, unfortunately, as in 1769, a Spanish expedition to the area led by Gaspar de Portola would enter the region in which the Chumash people inhabited, and if we know anything about the European conquest of the Americas, this did not go well. Many of the Chumash people were killed by the Spanish explorers, and the ones that weren't often succumbed to the diseases that were brought over by the Spanish and other European settlers. By the mid-1800s, the Chumash people's numbers were down to only around 2,800 versus the staggering 22,000 that inhabited the area before the Spanish conquest. Now, of course, modern advancement through the 1800s continued to drive the Chumash out from their land, and by 1870, most of them were reduced to working on local farms to make a living, which was most certainly a far cry from what they had prior. Now, it was with the Chumash is when the legend and the stories of the Dark Watchers would take shape. When the Spanish started making their way through the area of the Santa Lucia Mountains, they too saw something they couldn't fully understand. Now, the Spanish called these figures Los Vigilantes Oscuros, which literally translates to the Dark Watchers. Now, one on the surface might seem like an early legend from 1700 to 1800s America, doesn't just stop in the 1800s, as the Anglo-American settlers that moved into the region after the Spanish, they too, for some reason, said that they could feel the sensation of being watched from the hills. Now, it is often reported that the Dark Watchers can often disappear within the blink of an eye, or if you decide to turn away for 1 second and turn back, they're mysteriously vanished and they're gone. They also seem to vanish when witnesses try to get closer to investigate them and figure out what they actually are. Almost like if these beings are real, they do not want you to get close to them. Now, why that could be, there could be a plethora of reasons for that, but that's in case if you believe the idea that these are actual either creatures or actual entities of some sort, but of course we will go over all of those little theories in the theory section at the very end. Now, a part of the legend continues and states that if you are carrying more simple possessions, that the Dark Watchers are more likely to show themselves to you, versus if you come into the wilderness or if you're hiking the Santa Lucia Mountains and you come in there with a lot of fancy equipment, maybe a couple cell phones, maybe a fancy camera, that they're not really going to show themselves to you. They're not interested in that. Of course, that is just legend, and whether there is any evidence to kind of support the idea that the Dark Watchers show themselves to people who are carrying mere, just simple necessities, remains very unclear. Now, the Dark Watchers have had a profound impact on this area of California, and multiple authors who grew up in the area around the Santa Lucia Mountains have written stories about them, such as the famous author John Steinbeck. Now, if you've read any book, or even read any book through middle school and high school, you've probably heard of the author John Steinbeck. I know I certainly have, because I feel like I read 6 books of him through middle school and high school because everybody liked John Steinbeck so much. Now, Steinbeck grew up with the stories of the Dark Watchers, and his mother and grandmother were big believers in them, in the idea that they inhabited this area and that you needed to respect them. Steinbeck's mother, Olive Hamilton, was a firm believer in the existence of the Dark Watchers. So much so that, in fact, that she even traded with them, and said often when she would take her trips up into the mountains, she would bring them offerings of fruit, nuts, and flowers to give them as a sign of respect. Olive Hamilton would also tell John that the Watchers would usually give her back different flowers in that same spot when she came back through as almost a thank you gift for an offering. Now, that seems incredibly bizarre, and if true, it's a very compelling tale about the Dark Watchers. Because of the impact the Watchers had on Steinbeck's early life, he decided to mention them in one of his short stories he would write later on in his career called Flight. Now, in this short story, a Mexican-American boy kills a man and is forced to flee into the mountains. Now, in this story, his mother would mention to the boy, and I quote, "When thou comest to the high mountains, if thou seest any of the dark watching men, go not near to them, nor try to speak to them." Close quote. Now, in another part of this same short story, it would read the following. Pepe looked suspiciously back every minute or so, and his eyes sought the tops of the ridges ahead. Once, on a white barren spur, he saw a black figure for a moment, but he looked quickly away, for it was one of the Dark Watchers. No one knew who the Watchers were, nor where they lived, but it was better to ignore them, and never to show interest in them. They did not bother one who stayed on the trail and minded his own business. Close quote. Now, obviously, that is a story. However, it does cast kind of a light onto the impact these beings seem to have on the mountains and in the environment, and even the people who live within the area of the Santa Lucia Mountains. However, John Steinbeck wouldn't be the only author to write a story about the Dark Watchers. A California poet named Robinson Jeffers would mention them in a poem titled Such Counsels You Gave to Me, and in the poem, it would read the following, and I quote, "He thought it might be one of the Watchers, who are often seen in this length of coast range, forms that look human to human eyes, but certainly are not human. They come from behind ridges to watch." Close quote. Now, the recorded sightings of the Dark Watchers kind of seem to be few and far between. Why that might be the case is uncertain, but I was able to dig up one of these in my research. Here is one that I happened to find. And I quote, "One day I was hiking in the mountains where I lived near Blythe, California. As I went further on the trail, I felt like I was being watched. The hair on my arms stood up. As I turned around, worried it was a mountain lion. At the top of the mountain, I saw a hooded human figure. I couldn't see its face. The hood and cloak looked tattered and ripped. It made no sound. I turned around and went back the way I came. I never went back to that area of the mountain range again." And that sighting was provided by Dan from Phoenix, Arizona. Now, the old-timers around the Santa Lucia and Big Sur area stand behind the idea that the Dark Watchers are in fact real. But before we kind of dive into some possible theories as to what the Dark Watchers could be, I think we should go over a few other things first. On the surface, you would think that maybe this is a paranormal entity of some sort, and whether or not I think that, I will save to the end. But it is certainly not unheard of for spirits to have attachments to locations and even mountain ranges. This would most certainly, or they would not be most certainly free from the idea of spiritual possession. You also might have to consider the history of this land as well. There's a good chance that this area has seen a lot of death, starting back to the time of the Native Americans, and maybe even before that. A popular instance of a mountain being haunted would perhaps be the most notorious one, that being Mount Everest. Mount Everest, of course, seeks adventure seekers from all over the world to try and climb and reach the very top of its dangerous peak. But as we all know, many climbers never make it to the top. Hikers will often reference that even if you dare to take the trek alone, they say you never truly are. Due to the extreme cold of the mountain, many people who pass away on Mount Everest remain there. Their frozen, mummified bodies are a grim reminder to those who dare take the climb up to begin with. Now, a story from Mount Everest regarding the spiritual would be told from a Pemba Dorje Sherpa. Now, if I pronounced that incorrectly, I do apologize. Now, Pemba was a Nepalese mountaineer and a Sherpa, and he recalled a story, an encounter he had in 2004 when he was trying to break the speed record for the fastest climb of Everest. Now, Pemba was quoted with saying the following, and I quote, "When I paused at a mound of rocks, I saw some spirits in the forms of black shadows coming towards me, stretching their hands and begging for something to eat. I think those were the spirits of the many mountaineers killed during and after their ascent of Mount Everest." Close quote. Now, does that sound familiar to you? Now, while I instantly don't want to dive in and say that there might be a correlation between the two, I do want to point out another area of the world that has a very similar legend of that compared to the Dark Watchers. However, it's depending on who you ask. Now, in Scotland, there are stories that persist of a shadowy figure or creature that roams the mountain of Ben Macdui. Now, the Grey Man of Ben Macdui, known by the native Scottish as Amphir Liath Mór, is reported to be seen on this mountain of Ben Macdui. First documented and talked about by Professor J. Norman Colley, who was a professor at University College of London. Professor Cawley was an established professor, mountaineer, and scientist, and even invented the first ever iteration of the medical X-ray photograph. There's your weekly knowledge nugget for you in case you ever get that question on trivia night at your local bar. Now, Professor Cawley would give a speech in 1925 to an annual mountaineering club and told of an event that he had on the summit of Ben Macdui alone, 34 years prior in 1891. This is what he had to say, and I quote, "I was returning from the cairn on the summit in a mist, when I began to think I heard something else than merely the noise of my own footsteps. For every few steps I took, I heard a crunch, and then another crunch, as if someone was walking after me, but taking steps 3 or 4 times the length of my own. I said to myself, this is all nonsense. I listened, and I heard it again, but could see nothing in the mist. As I walked on, and the eerie crunch sounded behind me, I was seized with terror, and took to my heels, staggering blindly among the boulders for 4 or 5 miles, nearly down to the Rothamerkus forest." That word is Rothamerkus. I apologize. I could have pronounced that incorrectly, so I do want to apologize. Now the quote continues, and he says, "Whatever you make of it, I do not know. But there is something very queer about the top of Ben Macdui, and I will not go back there again. By myself, I know." Now, I do want to clarify, obviously, the Scottish, or the Old Scottish, they use the word queer to describe something as strange, so that's not referencing a person's sexual orientation. That is merely saying that the Old Scottish use that word to describe when something was very strange. So I just kind of wanted to clear the air on that, because you might be thinking, he said that? So I wanted to clear that up and clarify what that term actually meant in the context of this quote. Now, when Professor Cawley said this, it kind of whipped the club up into a frenzy, as this sparked intrigue as to what could be at the top of Ben Macdui. When Professor Cawley came out with this to the public and it started to gain news headlines, other witnesses started to come forward with their own experiences. However, the description of the Gray Man does vary. One of the most popular accounts comes from Alexander Tunian from 1958, recalling an experience he had in 1943. And I quote, "I am not unduly imaginative, but my thought flew instantly to the well-known story of Professor Cawley and the Fear Moor. Then I felt the reassuring weight of the loaded revolver in my pocket. Grasping the butt, I peered about in the mist here, rent and tattered by the eddies of wind. A strange shape loomed up, receded, came charging at me. Without hesitation, I whipped out the revolver and fired 3 times at the figure. When it still came on, I turned and hared down the path, reaching Glenderry in a time I have never bettered. You may ask, was it really the Fear Moor? Frankly, I think it was. Many times since then, I have traversed Macdui in the mist, bivouacked out in the open, camped on its summit for days on end on different occasions, often alone and always with an easy mind. For on that day, I am convinced, I shot the only Fear Moor my imagination will ever see." Close quote. Now, this account is incredibly vague, but it does seem to describe the Gray Man as more of a physical creature rather than a spiritual or supernatural one. However, this legend bears a lot of similarities to that of the Dark Watchers. The idea of a mist and fog-surrounded figure terrorizing hikers on the summit of a mountain sounds horrifying, and the theories behind the Gray Man of Ben Macdui are, quite frankly, all over the place. But the similarities in the sensations of being watched, and perhaps even the misty, shadow-like appearance in some instances, makes me think that maybe the cases are related, or at the bare minimum, a similar phenomenon is at play here. Now, I wanted to provide that story as well, because, like I said, I think it provides a role into what might truly be happening in the mountains of the Santa Lucias. And even maybe investigators and internet detectives cite a similar theory that connects to both of them. And I will dive into that right now when we go into theories. Now, I have a few theories that I want to go over with all of you. Each one kind of equally as compelling. Which, for once, actually, I could believe either any 3 of these. But I'm going going to go into detail on all three of them. Now, our first theory is that the Dark Watchers are actually ghosts or spirits of some sort. Now, this wouldn't be outside of the realm of possibility. Spiritual attachment to places, I think, is very real and can happen. We discussed just one instance previously, with this being the case at Mount Everest, and I think it would be reasonable to assume that with the amount of violence this area has seen, dating all the way back to when the Spanish conquistadors came through the region, it would be safe to assume that maybe some spirits are still restless. However, what makes me doubt this theory is the idea that people have described the Dark Watchers sometimes with hats and cloaks. I think this is not very characteristic of ghosts, but rather shadow people, and it just sounds so much like the modern legend of Hat Man, it makes me question if people are truly seeing that. Or perhaps their mind is altered, or thinking that they are seeing something that truly isn't there. Regardless, it certainly makes you wonder. Now, the idea of shadow people are very kind of out there on the internet. Anybody who's done any investigation into ghosts and spirits has probably come up and seen the idea of shadow people. Now, shadow people I very well could cover in its own separate episode, and obviously, like I mentioned before, I have done a whole episode on Hat Man. Now, that being said, do I think that this could be a shadow person in the Santa Lucia Mountains? It could be. However, I'm very doubtful in the idea that these shadow people are wearing hats and cloaks, as, like I said, maybe that is influenced by some sort of pop culture phenomenon, or maybe they are misidentifying features on the shadow person rather than thinking that it's wearing a hat and cloak. I think that if it has no discernible facial features, I think it's very challenging to identify whether or not a shadow person is wearing a hat and a cloak, especially from quite a distance away, as people tend to see these on ridges across. They're not right next to people. With the case of Hat Man is seen at the edge of people's beds, so people are able to discern a hat and a cloak because he's practically right next to you. So, with the idea of being able to discern a hat and a cloak from such a far range, kind of cast doubt onto the ghost/spirit theory, but I still kind of like that one a little bit, so I'm going to set that off to the side for now. Now, our second theory is called pareidolia. Now, this is one that many people credit to the idea of the Dark Watchers, and that is the scientific phenomenon known as pareidolia. Now, if you have no idea what that is, pareidolia is the concept of us humans seeing things that don't look human, but our brain creates visual patterns that resemble something that we are more familiar with, such as one of the most famous cases of pareidolia, Jesus on the toast. And if you have no idea what that is or what I'm talking about when I say Jesus on the toast, I will link a picture to my Instagram so you will have a better understanding of what I'm talking about. Now, many people speculate that a combination of pareidolia and hallucinations could be what's happening in the Santa Lucias. Hallucinations and the lack of oxygen in the brain can cause some wonky things. And it wouldn't surprise me if this could be what's happening in some instances. But I'm not fully sold on the pareidolia idea. Now, our last theory is another phenomenon called the Brocken Spectre. Now, the Brocken Spectre is a kind of visual phenomenon that was first discovered at the Brocken Peak, which is a mountain in the Harz mountain range in Germany. Now, what happens with the Brocken Spectre and kind of what causes these circumstances is when hikers are walking up the mountain and when the conditions are right with sun angle and mist levels, that your own shadow, or perhaps even another hiker's shadow, can be casted into the mist from afar. When this happens, the shape is disoriented and often enlarged, making it look like a much larger shadowy being is across the mountain from you. It's quite a sight, and I will link a picture of this to my Instagram as well when I post the cover art for this week's episode, so you can kind of see what the Brocken Spectre looks like. It's quite a very interesting phenomenon. Now, it's also quite an eerie sight, and other scientists think that perhaps the Brocken Spectre is generated through very low frequencies of infrasound, which can actually be generated just by the wind. Now, this infrasounds can have negative effects on the human brain as well. In 2003, a psychologist named Richard Wiseman tested low-frequency infrasound on a group of 700 people. He played sounds that were just below the human level of hearing, meaning they really didn't hear anything at all. However, at the end of this experiment, 22% of the group reported feeling uneasy, anxious, and fearful, and some even saying that they would have chills that would go up and down their spine. Now, this whole theory presents a very compelling case for the Brocken specter to be what's at play here. Obviously, the casting shadow in the mist and on the mountains would explain the sightings of the figures, and perhaps the low levels of infrasound created by wind gusts can be responsible for the feeling of being uneasy, or the feeling of being watched. In my opinion, this does make the most sense. Now, with that being said, my personal theory, I think some of these cases can be actual ghosts, but most likely, the prime candidate is the Brocken specter. I am thoroughly convinced, however, that the Santa Lucia Mountains have to be haunted in some capacity, and maybe that's what some people see when they're up there. However, like I just mentioned, I think the bulk of sightings are that of the Brocken specter, and people thinking that is some otherworldly entity that watches them from afar. That just makes sense, and the most sense for me personally. I don't want to rule out the possibility that some cases are genuine run-ins with the paranormal, and maybe that helps spur the legend. However, I think the majority of them are misidentifications of an actual scientific phenomenon. As for the Gray Man of Ben Macdui, maybe it is a similar instance of the Brocken specter, or maybe the reports of conflicting accounts of what the Gray Man looks like, whether it be a genuine creature or a shadow person, will remain a mystery. And maybe we will dive deeper into the case of the Gray Man of Ben Macdui in a case in a later episode. But with that being said, that is my personal opinion on the Dark Watchers. However, I think that there could be a plethora of things that are at play here, as I just mentioned. Obviously, I don't want to go the scientific route, and I always want to leave my brain and my opinion open for interpretation in terms of what the natural world can sometimes present ourselves with. However, I think the stories from mountain ranges all over the world being haunted carries a lot of weight to it. You hear stories from the Appalachian Trail of ghosts that haunt there. Obviously, we provided explanations for Mount Everest, and even if you want to say that maybe there's a ghost at the top of Ben Macdui, you could say that as well. However, the Dark Watchers kind of show us an interesting side of American legend and American folklore that isn't often talked about. You can go to really any portion of the United States, and each area has their own urban legends and lore that has kind of fostered this idea of the unexplained, the paranormal, and just really things that make our brain kind of think, what the hell? But that's going to end up doing it for this week's episode on the Dark Watchers. Let me know if you enjoyed it. Please give me feedback. You can leave me comments in the comments section. You can go to my Instagram. You can comment there. But as always, this is the moment where I will give my obligatory plugs. If you are listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you happen to be listening to this on YouTube, which is greatly outperforming Spotify right now, if you are listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out with the algorithm gods. I greatly appreciate it. And you'll get notified every time I post a new episode as well. With that being said, I also mentioned Instagram a couple times. I am on Instagram. Go ahead and follow me there. It is Unblurring the Unknown on Instagram. In addition to that, you can also send me topic suggestions. My episode queue continues to grow every week, so get those suggestions in if you happen to have one. But with that being said, this is going to conclude this week's episode on the Dark Watchers. I am taking a big U-turn for next week's episode, so stay tuned for that. It's something I have yet to do, and it's very, very interesting. I look forward to that. I'm having a lot of fun researching it, so look forward to next week as well. But with that being said, that is going to conclude everything. We're going to wrap it all up, and I will see you all on the next one.